Okay, so hello and thank you for doing this interview.
こちらこそありがとうございます。
I guess my first question is you were born in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm curious to know, have you ever gone back to visit?
いや、
So after I was born, about 1 year later, I came to Japan, and then I returned for elementary school and a year of middle school. But since then, I haven't returned.
Okay, well, now on to the more technical questions about GG 2020. What is the core idea that you want to achieve with Guilty Gear 2020, and how does this philosophy differ from previous Guilty Gear games?
So to kind of put it really simply, we've created the new Guilty Gear with the idea that sort of essence or the core element that makes Guilty Gear what it is can be enjoyed by a lot more people.
Okay. Over the years, Guilty Gear has had many mechanics like Blitz Shield, Roman cancels, burst. What game system do you think is the most fun to use, personally?
So the old Roman cancels, I felt were very speedy and it has a really good tempo to the game, but unfortunately it doesn't quite work in today's kind of gaming climate, I think.
Okay.
But I enjoyed that era of Roman cancel.
Okay. Romantic. Yes. Very bad. Guilty Gear has had many unique character systems, such as Johnny's coins and Robo-Ky's power gauge. Can we expect unique systems in Guilty Gear 2020 as well?
The philosophy with the old Guilty Gears is that we wanted to make every single character unique, which is probably why it transcended into the way that it is, where every character is so different from the others. With the new Guilty Gear, what we're trying to do is create a foundation of characters that are a little easier on the people who are playing it, and then once we have that foundation, add on a lot of unique characters.
So, over the years, you've always been willing to try extremely different approaches to gameplay with Guilty Gear. What is one aspect in your mind that must be present for a game to be called Guilty Gear?
So that's interesting because I think a lot of people ask me this question, and giving it some thought, it's not necessarily a certain game mechanic. It's more that sense of discovery. So when you start playing the game, you'll discover things and it'll kind of expand your imagination. The ability and feeling of discovering and having your imagination expand and finding different ways to play is what I think makes Guilty Gear Guilty Gear.
Okay. With that, the characters that we've seen so far have a feeling of being reinvented while keeping their core identity. How did you decide what to keep and what to throw away?
Traditionally, with the iterations and evolution of Guilty Gear, what we have done is really take the character that existed, so from the transition from Accent Core to Ixerd, what we did is we took what we had and then we tried to kind of mold it and shape it up based on what that existing character was. With the new Guilty Gear, we are taking a completely different approach where we strip them of everything and say, what's this character's concept? What's their sort of key terms, the key words, like the core of this character? And then once we establish that, we take the elements that we cast aside and see which ones work and apply to this concept and only keep those.
Just by the way, Soul's command grab right now is more scary than a Potemkin Buster. Just curious.
So it's a really interesting point, and that might very well be true. I think compared to old Guilty Gears, we really cranked up the firepower of each attack and each move. But what we discovered, and as our team members internally have been playtesting it, the time of each round hasn't really changed that much compared to older Guilty Gears. So what's happening is, although each move deals more damage, there's a lot more time to think, a lot more time to play mind games with each other.
Okay. So today, what do you think is the biggest barrier preventing new players from becoming fighting game fans?
That's actually a really difficult question, I think. And it's by no fault of the game itself, I feel. And there's just the large barrier to entry is due in part to the fact that a lot of people got a huge head start. So I think that naturally, their evolution and their progression is hard to overcome. And I'm going to kind of use an analogy that happened recently in Japan, but there was the World Cup for the rugby World Cup was hosted in Japan this year, and no one in Japan cared about rugby until that point. But all of a sudden, they made it to top 8, the Japanese team, and that gave them kind of a reason to understand and a reason to learn about it, and it grew really, really popular. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of rugby, players in the next generation. But that sort of little hook, that little spark is all it takes. So I think our job is really to help create tournaments, to create these platforms, and then groom kind of a hero figure that can hold that beacon and lead the people into the community and not feel so alienated.
So you've said that this game represents a full frontal confrontation with the nature of fighting games. How many times have you rebuilt the game to fit this ideal?
It's interesting because that battle is still happening in real time right now, and within the development team, we're constantly exploring what are the core elements that should be left behind because it is Guilty Gear, and what are the sort of new fun elements that are going to be implemented and added to all meet that criteria of a full frontal confrontation.
Okay.
So we're confronting among ourselves to confront the fighting game. And the sort of comparison is with Ixerd. We were really conscious of the existing fans. We were always kind of afraid to challenge different things, I feel, because we're like, we can't betray our fans, But with this one, we decided to take that step and expose ourselves and say, look, that might happen, but we have to take on this challenge. So it's a completely different approach.
With this confrontation, with, again, the nature of fighting games, are you looking at, or did you look at any current Japanese or Western fighting games and the audience reception to those games to help figure out the direction?
So having been at EVO this year and watching games like Tekken and Samurai Showdown, it really kind of opened my mind in terms of how easy it is for the spectator to spectate a match. And I think that is something that they do really well. Like, even if you don't understand fighting games, you're not really a gamer, you can still watch the screen, what's on the screen of this game, and understand exactly what's going on, who's winning, who's under pressure, who's kind of on the offense, etc. So in terms of how the audience perceives it, I think it's really well constructed. When I answer this question in interviews, I think the word that gets tossed around a lot is simplify. We're simplifying this, simplifying that, and that's just, to me, a limitation of vocabulary and language. We're not necessarily simplifying the game as much as we're trying to create an enjoyable experience for all people, like spectators and then some.
Okay, so to get a little bit more specific with the game, in a previous interview in Famitsu, you mentioned that this game was being designed from the ground up without the need for a stylish mode for new players. In Guilty Gear 2020, combos are shorter, there's less okizeme, and you don't get stuck in the corner as often. However, joystick motions for special inputs are still traditional. Do you feel that players might still have difficulty with this aspect?
That's very valuable input, and a conversation that's happening again right now in real time. And right before I came to LA, I was discussing this with my team members, and I feel fighting games of old had a lot of difficult commands and inputs as well, but that didn't necessarily stop people from playing them and enjoying them at various different levels. And if you do want to improve, that player would then challenge themselves and start to understand and learn these commands. But the opposite faction inside the development team tells me, it's unreasonable to expect that level of dedication in this current climate. So I am of the belief that people can challenge themselves, but I think there's a certain different kind of conversation and wave, if you will. So that's actually a discussion and argument that's happening in real time.
And following up on that question, at the same time, there are many players that love the difficulty that they encounter sometimes, and they fell in love with moments like the Daigo parry in Third Strike, right? That shows high skill. Is the balance between appealing to the new player and also keeping the spirit of those difficult moments like the biggest challenge?
It's certainly very difficult, and the most difficult, possibly, yes. I think a lot of small tweaks and adjustments can always be done later on, but the sort of core message that we want to convey to players is something that has to be set in stone very, very early on in development. So it is a huge challenge, and I think it's one of the most difficult decisions.
The new samurai character looks very cool. There's a theory online that because he was revealed at the same time as the new character Leroy Smith in Tekken, that there might be a relation between them. Is there any truth to this? Are you working with Harada?
確かに前日
I will admit to having dinner with Harada the night before, but we did not discuss our trailers.
Okay, okay. In 2015, there was a GDC talk about the workflow of creating Exerd's 3D models. It's one of the most beautiful fighting games ever made, but this new game looks even more impressive. How have you updated that workflow since 2015?
I feel what we set out to achieve in terms of Exerd with respect to the sort of visual expression has really been perfected through Dragon Ball FighterZ and games like Grand Blue Fantasy, where at the time, we thought if we try to evolve this even more, do the same thing, it's going to end up being the same thing anyway, and they're doing such a good job at it, why challenge that? So instead of looking at references in 2D animation, which was a big source of our reference for Exerd, we shifted our focus to live action movies and the dynamic camera movements and different forms of expression that these movies have as opposed to anime.
Okay, so it sounds like you're continuing to work with Naoki Hashimoto on the music. Will he be doing all of the vocal tracks this time?
I don't know if I can commit to all at this very moment, but we are asking him to do a lot of vocals for us right now.
Okay. By the way, his old band, Outrage, was that the reason why the weapons Soul created were called Outrages?
A lot of the people and things and names that occur inside the Guilty Gear universe are heavily inspired by different metal bands. So the first time I offered Hashimoto-san, can we work on this together, he accepted it. I was very excited and relieved that I would get to name something Outrage.
Okay. I hope that the heavy metal influences and design aspects continue into the new game. It's one of my favorite parts of Guilty Gear is having heavy metal as a part of it. So some fans feel that back in Guilty Gear X and Double X, some of the character animations and stages were more gruesome and heavy. For example, Testament had some really crazy animations, and their stages like a graveyard. Do you feel that your tastes have evolved and that's why we see a little bit less of that in the current games?
So I think the older Guilty Gears was a much more direct reflection of my expression or what I was trying to express. For example, I was very heavily inspired by a lot of heavy metal album jackets or key art, and I would do a direct, I would personally sketch the sort of base layout or how I envision certain stages, whereas now we have environment artists and other designers, so I would first tell them the feel and vibe that I want, and then they would sketch it. So I think that cushion of having another person interpret what I want might be what's one of the causes of why it feels different.
Okay. The single player experience and online content is now more important for getting new players to keep playing the game over a long period of time. Are you thinking of any kinds of new modes that might help accomplish this goal?
So I myself have tons of ideas of how we can expand and include different modes that might fulfill that. However, whether or not that's going to happen or not, we still don't have a firm answer. There's a lot of other forces and powers at play.
I'm very happy to hear that the team is listening to fans that are asking about rollback, GGPO, and things like that. For many years, netcode that works well in Japan has struggled internationally. Do you have any thoughts about online play in fighting games right now?
So the conversation about rollback netcode is actually being investigated right now internally as we speak, and this is not just limited to the new Guilty Gear, but also all designers and programmers across the company are kind of looking at it and examining it. And it is a conversation of whether or not it's optimal for a certain game. So there are some programmers who are like, yes, this is great, we should do this, we should, all the new games should have this, and some that feel like this is really a good fit for these types of code and programming. So really, it's a discussion that's happening right now, and I think it will kind of change the type of games that we'll have in the future, but there's no direct conclusion right as of this moment.
And just on a personal note, I'm very happy that Guilty Gear and fighting games are more popular now than ever. What does the future of fighting games look like to you?
I think it's really just the beginning. We're scratching the surface, especially at Arc System Works. And more traditionally, I think fighting games were seen as a tool of kind of battle. It was like a way to have battles unfold, which is not necessarily the case anymore, I feel. It's one of my goals that it becomes a tool of connecting people, a tool of expanding networks. So I think the very first or next step that I would like to achieve is to really expand that circle, expand that community, and then use fighting games as a platform to connect with people that you may have never been able to before.
Okay. All right. That was it.終わりです.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yes, with that, thank you very much for your time and for your questions.
Of course.
And, we look forward to Guilty Gear 2020.
楽しみにしてます。
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
はい